I get it!
People have been arguing about this scene for almost 20 years now. Some say he finally understood why Christopher couldn't stop using. Others think it was something about the universe being connected, everything flowing into everything else. Some people say he was on peyote, and it felt profound for about 15 seconds, which, fair enough. None of those answers are completely wrong, they all catch something real about that night. But I've always felt like there's something more specific going on that most people miss. Because if you actually follow the full movement of the episode, from Christopher dying in that car, to Tony laughing on the casino floor, to what he says to Melfi a few episodes later, there's one thread running through all of it that ties it together. And once you see it, the whole thing clicks in a way it didn't before. Tony does tell us what he understood. He simply cannot hold the thought long enough to explain it cleanly. His revelation is about family. More precisely, it is about the lifelong belief that family can repair the wound created by family. Tony has been in Melfi's office since season 1 talking about Livia. He describes a woman who responded to his childhood vulnerability with threats and cruelty, who once told him she wished he had never been born, who looked at him with what he called an empty look whenever he needed something real from her. He cannot stop returning to those memories even after she dies, and that hunger is what he eventually pours into Christopher. He makes Christopher his chosen son and future heir, hoping this younger version of himself will prove that the Soprano way can still produce loyalty, love, and meaning. Christopher becomes proof of the opposite. When Tony kills him and feels relief, the entire fantasy collapses. The peyote allows Tony to see family as a temporary vehicle. People bring us into the world, travel beside us for a while, and move on. The endless attempt to climb back toward them only creates more suffering. Tony finally understands that he can let go of his mother, his father, his failed son, and the person he thought he was supposed to become for all three of them. He reaches a genuine insight and immediately turns it into permission to feel innocent about murder. That is the answer. The rest of the episode explains how he gets there. Christopher has occupied the position of son for years. Tony calls him family, protects him, promotes him, punishes him, and repeatedly explains that he is preparing Christopher to carry the organization into the future. Blood gives Tony a reason to trust him. Youth gives Tony somewhere to place the future. Christopher is supposed to become the successful result of everything Tony inherited. The plan contains a quiet form of self-repair. At one point, Tony tells Christopher that he is going to run North Jersey someday. He says it like a promise, though beneath it is the need for someone to finally receive what Tony was given and do something better with it. He cannot go back and receive a different father or undo what Johnny Boy made him into. He can take Christopher and become the father he believes he deserved, guide him, make him strong, and create the loyalty that Livia and Johnny Boy never gave him. If Christopher succeeds, Tony gets to believe the family line has been corrected. Christopher keeps ruining that idea. He uses heroin. He complains about the sacrifices he makes for Tony. He wants a life in movies. He falls in love with Adriana and hands her to Tony when she becomes an informant, expecting that sacrifice to mean something forever. He gets sober and discovers that the people around him prefer the version who drank with them. He makes Cleaver, where his resentment toward Tony appears on a cinema screen wearing a cheap horror costume. Every failure forces Tony to look at the relationship he created. Christopher becomes unstable, resentful, and increasingly difficult to control. More painfully, he becomes honest about what life under Tony has done to him. He cannot always say it directly, though it comes out through addiction, anger, and fantasy. Tony sees the accusation anyway. By the time we reach the episode before Kennedy and Heidi, the bond has almost completely rotted. Christopher tries to remain sober while Tony and Polly mock him. He watches them laugh at his daughter and realizes the room will never respect him. He returns home, murders JT Dolan, and enters the next episode carrying the emotional wreckage of a relationship that has already ended. The car simply gives Tony the chance to make the ending permanent. The episode gives its title to Kennedy and Heidi, two girls who appear briefly and continue driving after the crash. Heidi worries about losing her learner's permit. Kennedy suggests returning, though the car keeps moving. Their decision leaves Tony alone with Christopher and creates the privacy he needs to kill him. Tony behaves like them on a larger scale. He sees the wreckage, recognizes what responsibility requires, and chooses the route that allows him to keep moving. Calling for help would preserve Christopher and every problem attached to him. Closing his nose clears the road. That same desire sits inside the later revelation. Tony is exhausted by the people who keep pulling him backward. Livia, Johnny Boy Jr., Christopher, and even his children make life feel like debts he can never finish paying. The desert offers a world with no demands and no witnesses. Everything moves, everything passes, and nobody has to turn the car around. Kennedy and Heidi never learn what their choice allowed. Tony knows what his choice allowed and spends the episode trying to make ignorance out of knowledge. The bus idea gives him the step. Leaving can become the natural order of life. Christopher loses control while driving. The vehicle rolls down the hill. Tony survives with minor injuries. Christopher is badly hurt and tells him that he will never pass a drug test. Tony begins calling for help, looks toward the damaged baby seat, and closes Christopher's nose. The baby seat quickly becomes Tony's favorite part of the story. A branch has gone through the spot where the baby might have been sitting. Tony repeats the detail to Carmela and other people at the wake. He describes the child mangled beyond recognition. Each repetition makes Christopher's death sound more responsible. Tony can present himself as the man who prevented a future disaster. The baby was somewhere else that night. Tony kills Christopher over a child who was never in danger during the crash. The image gives him a future victim to place beside the real victim choking in front of him. Tony has always been skilled at turning a desire into a duty. He wants Christopher gone. The baby seat allows him to call that desire protection. His relief arrives before the body is buried. In a dream, Tony finally says what he cannot say while awake. Christopher had become a drag on his thoughts about the future. He was the greatest mistake of Tony's career. With Christopher gone, Tony no longer has to be confronted by that mistake. That last idea carries more weight than his fear of a drug relapse or an FBI betrayal. When Christopher got sober, Tony and the crew made it uncomfortable rather than easy. They mocked it, found the clean version of Christopher harder to be around than the one who drank with them, and never once treated the attempt like something worth protecting. Every time Christopher tried to move toward something different, the room made clear it preferred the version it already knew. Christopher had become a living record of what that pattern produced, and whenever he appeared, Tony had to look at the result. Death removes the evidence. Tony expects the relief to spread. He searches Carmela's reaction during the phone call and later claims that he heard a trace of it. Carmela rejects the suggestion. In therapy, he complains about the grief surrounding him and the effort required to pretend he shares it. At the wake, he keeps mentioning the baby seat, almost begging someone to understand that Christopher's death has improved the world. Nobody gives him what he wants. That failure drives the trip to Las Vegas. Tony says he wants peace and quiet. His actual destination is one of Christopher's hidden lives. Sonia knew Christopher away from New Jersey. She shared drugs with him, heard some of his sadness, and existed outside the crew's expectations. Tony enters her apartment carrying the news of Christopher's death, sleeps with her, and takes the peyote Christopher once took. There is something ugly in how completely Tony occupies Christopher's place. He takes the woman, the drug, the private escape, and even the sadness Sonia associates with Christopher. She tells Tony that he seems genuinely sad. He answers that he does not feel sad right now. Christopher spent years trying to escape Tony. Tony kills him and treats the escape like an inheritance. Before taking the peyote, Tony admits that he always wanted to try it and never could because of his responsibilities. Christopher has just died. The man Tony described as a major responsibility and a constant burden on the future. For the first time in years, Tony has no son to manage, no heir to rescue, and no failed project staring back at him. The drug enters that relief and expands it. At the roulette table, Tony stares at the spinning wheel and compares it to the solar system. The ball circles the center. People gather around it, placing money on outcomes they cannot control. Tony has spent the previous episodes losing at gambling and treating each loss like a personal insult. Now he begins winning. As the chips collect, he says he's dead and falls to the floor laughing. Christopher is present in the revelation from the beginning. The words connect the death to Tony's sudden luck. His burden is gone, the wheel turns in his favor, and the world continues without any visible punishment. Tony feels a pattern forming. The private relief he could not share at the funeral now seems written into the movement of the universe. Many interpretations stop here and conclude that Tony believes the universe rewarded him for killing Christopher. That idea belongs in the answer, though it only explains the casino. Tony's later account to Melfi moves towards something larger than the visible world and directly into an image about mothers, children, and letting go. Tony tells Melfi that everything people see and experience is only part of what exists. Something else is there. When she asks him to explain, he cannot. He reaches for an image instead. Mothers are buses. They bring children into the world, drop them off, and continue on their own journey. The children spend their lives trying to get back on the bus. Tony says they should let it go. That thought survives after the peyote wears off. It is the clearest piece of, I get it. Tony has spent 6 seasons trying to get back onto Livia's bus. Her death never ended the relationship. He brings her into Melfi's office for years. He finds her in Gloria, Valentina, Carmela, Janice, and every woman who makes love feel conditional. He remembers the threats, the cruelty, and the empty looks she gave him whenever he needed comfort. He understands that she damaged him and still behaves as though one final explanation might force the past to change. Johnny Boy controls him in a quieter way. Tony has a memory of his father as a young man, exciting and brutal and full of energy, bringing him along to collect a debt as though it were a perfectly normal thing for a boy to witness. He remembers it with something close to admiration, and that admiration is what makes the rest of the pattern possible. He blames Livia for the unhappiness of the marriage, avoids admitting how much Johnny Boy used him, and inherits the business, the violence, the mistresses, and the habit of calling selfishness responsibility. His parents are dead and still driving. The bus image allows Tony to imagine stepping off. They brought him here. They continued on. He can stop chasing them. Christopher stands on the other side of the same pattern. Tony became the bus driver for him. He brought Christopher into the center of the criminal family, pointed him toward a future, and demanded that he remain loyal to the root. Christopher spent years trying to climb back toward Tony whenever the relationship broke. Adriana, sobriety, movies, marriage, and fatherhood could pull him away for a while. He kept returning for approval. Tony hated the neediness because he recognized it. Christopher's reflected his own back at him. Tony spent years reaching toward Livia's memory for something she withheld, and Christopher spent years reaching toward Tony for something Tony would not give. He saw it clearly enough in Christopher to find it irritating, but never honestly enough in himself to do anything about it. Christopher wanted from Tony what Tony still wanted from Livia and Johnny Boy. Love had to be proven through sacrifice. Loyalty had to survive humiliation. Every attempt to leave became betrayal. Each man expected the other to heal something that began before their relationship existed. The crash ends that cycle through violence. Tony kills the person who kept asking him to be a father. Once Christopher is dead, Tony feels the responsibility leave his body. Peyote turns that release into a wider belief. Parents and children carry each other for a time. Eventually the vehicle moves on. The desperate attempt to return only creates pain. Tony cries out, "I get it," when he finally feels capable of releasing the family story that has controlled him. The insight is real. His application of it is horrifying. A healthy version of letting go would require Tony to accept that Livia could never love him properly, that Johnny Boy damaged him, and that Christopher became another victim of the life they passed down. Tony could stop protecting his parents, stop demanding that Christopher repair him, and accept his own part in the destruction. Tony chooses an easier release. Christopher is gone, so responsibility can leave with him. His parents belong to the past, so their influence can become an excuse he has finally outgrown. The universe feels enormous, his individual act feels small, and the emotional debt disappears into the desert. He discovers acceptance without accountability. This reading also explains the flash of light in the sky. Earlier in Season 6, Tony sees a beacon during the Kevin Finnerty coma. He stands near a house filled with figures from some lost family gathering. Entering would mean surrendering his identity and possibly his life. Meadows' voice pulls him away. He wakes believing he has received another chance. The chance fades. "Every day is a gift" becomes another phrase Tony uses while returning to the same appetites. He never understands what the beacon asked of him. The light returns in Nevada after Christopher's death. Tony has removed the person he once called a son and entered the desert with no responsibilities around him. This time he faces the light and feels an answer. Life is larger than the family roles he has carried. He can let the dead continue on their journey. The episode refuses to celebrate the answer with him. Back in New Jersey, asbestos connected to Tony's business is dumped into the environment while ducks can be heard nearby. Tony is enjoying a revelation about universal connection while the consequences of his choices travel into water he will never see. He understands connection as a feeling. He avoids the version that creates obligation. That is where the theory about everything being connected falls short. Tony certainly feels a connection between the roulette wheel, the solar system, death, chance, and the sunset. Connection describes the shape of the experience. The content appears later in the bus metaphor. His mind has joined Christopher's death to the old wound of family and discovered that he can release both. The theory that Tony finally understands Christopher's drug use reaches another piece of the night. Peyote gives him the escape Christopher once chased. Tony experiences wonder, freedom, and relief from his ordinary mind. He may understand why Christopher wanted that feeling. Sonia even brings Christopher into the conversation before they take the drug. That explanation reaches only the doorway. Tony returns from Nevada speaking about mothers, unseen reality, and letting go. The drug opens the door. His mind walks toward the family wound that shaped his entire life. The theory that Tony embraces evil also misses how sincere his joy is. Tony stands in the desert convinced that he has reached wisdom. He experiences the revelation as freedom from an old emotional prison. The horror comes from watching him use spiritual language to escape the moral weight of what he did. Tony has practiced this throughout the series. In therapy, he learns that his panic attacks trace back to his father bringing him along as a child to watch a man get beaten over a debt. He understands that connection completely. He carries it around like something that answers a question about him, uses it as the explanation for who he became, and keeps doing everything the understanding was supposed to address. He gets the insight and keeps the behavior. Buddhism, Catholicism, near-death experiences, and now peyote all pass through the same mind and come out the other side having reduced his guilt without changing his direction. I get it. becomes the purest version of that habit. For one morning, Tony sees that his mother cannot be recovered, his father cannot be corrected, and Christopher cannot complete the family story he inherited. Nobody is coming back to give him the childhood he wanted. Nobody he mentors can prove that his life was worth passing down. The bus has already dropped him off. He can finally stop chasing it. The relief should have led him toward grief. It should have allowed him to mourn the parents he never truly had and the surrogate son he helped ruin. Tony skips that part. He takes the freedom and abandons the responsibility. That is why he's dead comes before I get it. Christopher's death creates the emotional opening. The roulette wheel gives the opening a cosmic shape. The sunset turns it into certainty. The following episode translates the certainty into the only language Tony can find. People arrive. They carry us. They leave. We suffer when we keep trying to return. Tony finally understands the lesson. He also misunderstands what it demands from him. Letting Christopher go should mean facing what happened between them. Tony uses it to erase Christopher completely. Letting Livia and Johnny Boy go should mean taking ownership of the man he became. Tony uses it to feel released from the entire history. He turns emotional independence into moral immunity. Tony supplies the approval himself. He can convert almost any revelation into permission for the life he already wants. The sunset feels like a verdict because Tony has already decided what he wants the verdict to say, and the drug makes that decision feel sacred to him. In the desert, he feels free from his parents, free from Christopher, free from the future he built around him, and free from the guilt that followed the murder. For one bright moment, the family stops driving. Tony stands alone in the sunset and celebrates. He finally got off the bus. He left Christopher underneath it.